A love affair that crossed forbidden lines, a secret that tore a family apart, and a single, fatal stab wound that turned a nephew's escape into a tragedy. This is the chilling story of Nor McKee and Bjorn Norton. Before we go into the details of the story, please note that this video contains true crime content, including themes of violence and betrayal, which some viewers may find distressing. While the events are based on a real case, some names and details have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. This content is intended for educational and informational purposes, helping to explore the complexities of justice and human behavior. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. It's a story that seems too shocking to be true. A 37-year-old woman, respected in her Texas community, accused of fatally stabbing her 25-year-old nephew. She claims it was self-defense. But as the layers of their secret life unraveled, a darker and more disturbing truth came to light. A years-long affair that no one in their family saw coming. On a quiet evening in August 2024, tragedy struck a home that was already crumbling under the weight of unspoken secrets. Bjorn Norton, bloodied and desperate, tried to flee in his car. But before he could escape, he crashed into the very home he was running from. By the time help arrived, he was gone. The cause of death? A single stab wound to his back. At the center of it all was Nor McKee, an aunt, a lover, and now a suspect in a case that would grip her community and send shockwaves far beyond it. Was she a victim of years of abuse, driven to an act of survival? Or was this a cold and calculated move to silence her nephew and protect her darkest secret? This case isn't just about a single moment of violence. It's about the unraveling of a forbidden relationship. It's about manipulation, betrayal, and how one family's foundation was shaken to its core. Let me introduce you to the key players in this tragic tale. First, there's Nor McKee, the woman at the center of the storm. Known for her composed demeanor and devotion to her family, she was the last person anyone would have suspected of harboring such a secret. Then there's Bjorn Norton, her nephew, 25 years old and full of potential. He was charming, confident, and close to his family, or so they thought. Beneath his polished surface lay a man whose life was far more complicated than anyone realized. We also have Zendaya Dawson, the concerned family member who first reported that something wasn't right. Her 911 call would set everything in motion. And finally, Chris Hester, the law enforcement officer who first arrived at the chaotic scene and later found himself entangled in a case that was far more complicated than a simple domestic dispute. In this documentary, we'll go beyond the headlines to explore the tangled web of secrets, emotions, and lies that led to Bjorn's tragic death. From the beginnings of their affair to the deadly confrontation that brought it all crashing down, we'll tell you the full story of what happened and why. The answers lie in the events of August 9, 2024. But to truly understand how things spiraled so far out of control, we'll have to go back. Back to the start of Nor and Bjorn's story. Brace yourself. This is a tale of love, betrayal, and blood. Let's dive into the detailed background of Nor McKee, starting with her life before everything unraveled. Nor McKee's story began like many others in small-town Texas. She was born and raised in a family where traditions ran deep and family ties were paramount. Her parents, immigrants who had worked tirelessly to build a stable life, instilled in Nor a strong sense of duty and loyalty to her family. For years, she lived by those values, embracing her role as a devoted daughter, a nurturing sister, and later, a loving wife. Nor married young, barely out of her teenage years. Her husband, Soren Fitzpatrick, was someone her family approved of. He was steady, dependable, and seemed to have his future mapped out. From the outside, they appeared to have the perfect union. A hard-working couple with shared dreams of building a life together. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, Nor felt trapped. Soren's predictability, which had once seemed comforting, began to feel suffocating. Over time, their relationship grew distant. They didn't argue much, they simply stopped connecting. Soren buried himself in work, and Nor, feeling isolated, buried herself in the routine of family gatherings, cultural traditions, and playing the role of the perfect wife. By her early 30s, Nor's marriage had unraveled entirely. The divorce was quiet, without much fanfare or drama, but it left her shaken. She had spent over a decade building a life that no longer existed. While she kept a composed exterior, inside, Noor felt adrift. For the first time in her life, she didn't know who she was or where she was headed. She was single, childless, and unsure of her purpose. In her small Texas town, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, Noor quickly became a topic of speculation. Friends and neighbors spoke in hushed tones, wondering why her marriage had failed. The scrutiny only deepened her sense of isolation. Noor put on a brave face, attending family events and community gatherings as if nothing had changed. But behind the mask, she was struggling. She began seeking comfort in familiar places, her family. This is where Bjorn Norton enters the story. Bjorn was Noor's nephew, the son of her younger sister. From the time he was a boy, Bjorn had been a vibrant presence in Noor's life. He was the kind of kid who could light up a room with his smile, always quick with a joke or a story. As he grew older, that charm only deepened. By his mid-20s, Bjorn was known as the golden boy of the family. He was charismatic, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to those he loved. Family gatherings were a cornerstone of their lives. Birthdays, holidays, and weekly dinners brought everyone together, strengthening their bond. It was during one of these gatherings, shortly after her divorce, that Noor found herself drawn to Bjorn in a way she hadn't expected. First, it was harmless. Bjorn had a knack for making people feel seen and heard, and Noor was no exception. They began talking more, longer conversations that started at the dinner table and carried on into late-night phone calls. Bjorn would listen to Noor talk about her struggles, her loneliness, and the overwhelming pressure to maintain her family's respect. He had a way of making her feel less alone, as if he truly understood her pain. To Noor, Bjorn wasn't just her nephew. He became her confidant, her lifeline during a time when she felt like she was drowning. But what started as emotional support began to shift into something more dangerous. The family's close-knit dynamic played a role in how this bond developed. In their culture, family was everything. Noor and Bjorn spent hours together at family functions, often helping prepare meals, cleaning up after gatherings, or simply sitting outside and talking while everyone else went to bed. Their closeness didn't seem unusual at first. In fact, it was celebrated. Family members often remarked on how wonderful it was that Noor and Bjorn had such a strong bond. But behind the smiles and laughter at family dinners, something deeper and far more troubling was taking shape. Bjorn, 10 years her junior, began to see Noor as more than just an aunt. And Noor, desperate for connection and blinded by her emotional vulnerability, found herself reciprocating. Their closeness didn't go unnoticed. Zendaya Dawson, Bjorn's older cousin, later recalled that something felt off between the two. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an intensity to their interactions that didn't seem normal. Zendaya dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to Noor's need for companionship and Bjorn's naturally affectionate nature. But as we now know, this was the beginning of something far more destructive. Bjorn Norton was the kind of man people gravitated toward. At 25, he was charming in a way that felt effortless. Whether it was his infectious laugh, his sharp sense of humor, or the confidence he exuded, Bjorn had a way of making people feel like they were the only person in the room. To outsiders, he seemed like the golden child, the one who had it all figured out. Bjorn came from a large, close-knit family that placed immense value on tradition and success. His parents, particularly his father, expected greatness from him. From a young age, Bjorn was told that he had the potential to achieve anything, but with that came the weight of their expectations. He was pushed to excel in school, to build a career, and to become a source of pride for the family. While Bjorn tried to rise to the occasion, there was always a part of him that felt like he was never enough. Underneath his polished exterior, Bjorn struggled with insecurities that he kept hidden from everyone. He worried that he would disappoint his family, that he would never be able to live up to their standards. He masked his doubts with charm, always playing the role of the confident, easygoing son, nephew, and cousin. But privately, he felt lost, torn between who he wanted to be and who his family expected him to become. After graduating college, Bjorn took a corporate job that was stable but unfulfilling. He worked long hours and spent his free time at family gatherings or with his friends. To the outside world, he seemed happy. He had a steady job, a wide social circle, and a family that adored him. But deep down, Bjorn felt like something was missing. He craved connection, understanding, and validation, things he never admitted to anyone. This internal struggle left Bjorn vulnerable, especially when it came to his relationships. While he had plenty of friends and even dated occasionally, nothing ever felt serious or meaningful. He had a habit of self-sabotaging, pushing people away before they could get too close. Over time, this emotional distance became a part of who he was. In the summer of 2021, around the time Noor's marriage was falling apart, Bjorn's life was also in a state of quiet chaos. He felt stuck, aimless, and unsure of what his future held. That's when his relationship with Noor began to change. What had always been a warm familial bond slowly evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. It began innocently enough. Late nights at family gatherings, when everyone else had gone to bed, Noor and Bjorn would find themselves lingering. Sitting at the kitchen table, sharing cups of tea, they talked for hours. Noor spoke of her divorce and how it left her feeling hollow. Bjorn listened, offering words of comfort and encouragement. And in return, he shared his own frustrations, his struggles with meeting his family's expectations, his feelings of inadequacy, and his fear of never finding his purpose. These conversations became a ritual. Week after week, they found solace in each other's company. What started as an emotional connection between an aunt and her nephew became something deeper. Noor saw in Bjorn a sense of freedom and youth that she longed for. And Bjorn saw in Noor a source of understanding and warmth that he had never found elsewhere. As the months went by, their bond grew stronger. They began seeking each other out at family events, making excuses to be alone together. They shared private jokes, exchanged text messages late into the night, and developed an intimacy that crossed boundaries neither of them had ever imagined crossing. But with this closeness came a heavy weight of guilt. Noor knew what they were doing was wrong, morally, culturally, and within their family. And Bjorn, despite his feelings, knew that if their relationship was exposed, it would destroy everything. The danger only heightened their connection. At family functions, they exchanged hidden glances, quick touches, and fleeting moments of closeness when no one was looking. Every stolen moment felt like a risk, but it also made their bond feel intoxicating. For 3 years, they kept their relationship hidden. They became experts at deception, carefully managing how they interacted in front of others. At times, they even convinced themselves that no one would ever find out. But in truth, their secret was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. Zendaya Dawson, one of Bjorn's cousins, later admitted that she began to suspect something was off long before the truth came out. There was just this energy between them, she recalled. It wasn't something I could put into words, but it felt strange, like they were too close, too in sync. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Despite the risks, Noor and Bjorn couldn't seem to let each other go. Their connection had become an addiction, a dangerous and forbidden tie that neither of them knew how to sever. But secrets like theirs never stay hidden forever. And as the years went on, the strain of their relationship began to take its toll. Tensions rose. Fights became more frequent. And when Bjorn started threatening to reveal the truth, the cracks in their carefully constructed facade began to show. What began as a secret bond of comfort and love would soon spiral into manipulation, fear, and ultimately tragedy. For 3 years, Noor and Bjorn lived in the shadows of their secret. In the beginning, their relationship was intoxicating. For Noor, it was a reprieve from the loneliness and emptiness she had felt since her divorce. For Bjorn, it was validation, proof that he was worthy of love and attention in a way he hadn't experienced before. But what felt like a deep, hidden connection would soon turn into something much darker. As time went on, the cracks in their relationship began to show. The initial excitement that had brought them together was replaced by suspicion, arguments, and manipulation. Bjorn, once the charming, carefree nephew, became increasingly possessive of Noor. He began monitoring her behavior, questioning her loyalty, and growing angry if she didn't respond to his texts or calls quickly enough. What had started as a secret love affair turned into an emotional prison for Noor. She felt suffocated by Bjorn's constant need for control and his growing paranoia. He would accuse her of pulling away from him, of losing interest, and of only using him as a temporary escape. At times, he'd lash out with words designed to cut deep. He'd call her a coward, accuse her of being ashamed of him, and blame her for putting him in a situation he claimed had ruined his life. Noor, meanwhile, began to feel trapped. What once felt like a source of comfort had now become a heavy burden. She worried constantly about being exposed. The thought of her family finding out about their relationship haunted her. She pictured the disappointment in her parents' eyes, the anger of her siblings, and the judgment from her community. It wasn't just her reputation that was at stake. She knew this secret could destroy her entire family. Her fear of exposure only fueled Bjorn's insecurities. The more Noor tried to create emotional distance, the more Bjorn clung to her. His possessiveness turned to anger, and his anger quickly spiraled into something much worse. Bjorn's anger soon turned into threats. It started subtly, with comments designed to remind Noor that he held power over her. "What do you think your family would do if they knew?" he'd say during their arguments. At first, Noor tried to brush it off, convincing herself that he was just speaking out of frustration. But the threats escalated quickly. By early 2024, Bjorn's words became more direct and more terrifying. He began sending Noor text messages, bombarding her with hateful and abusive language. In a single week, he sent her hundreds of messages, many of them filled with explicit threats. Some of the texts were chilling. "You'll regret ignoring me. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. Do you really think you can cut me off? You think I won't tell your parents everything? If I see you again, I'll put you in a coma." Bjorn seemed to delight in pushing Noor to the brink. The messages were relentless. Morning, noon, and night, her phone would buzz with his threats and accusations. Noor stopped sleeping. She became paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder and fearing that Bjorn might show up at her home unannounced. One night, after an especially heated argument, Bjorn crossed a line that Noor couldn't ignore. He confronted her at her house, demanding to speak with her. When she refused to let him in, he pounded on the door, yelling loud enough for her neighbors to hear. When Noor opened the door to try and calm him down, Bjorn grabbed her arm with such force that it left a bruise. He screamed at her, calling her vile names and blaming her for everything that had gone wrong in his life. That night, Noor confided in her sister Zendaya Dawson, though she left out key details of their relationship. She told Zendaya that Bjorn had been harassing her, sending her threatening messages, and showing up uninvited. Zendaya, concerned but unaware of the full extent of the situation, urged Noor to speak with someone about it. But Noor, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, didn't take her advice. The violence only escalated. Weeks before the tragic night of August 9th, Bjorn gave Noor a black eye during a heated argument. She wore sunglasses to family gatherings to hide the bruise, but whispers began to spread among her relatives. Zendaya later testified that she had noticed Noor's behavior change during this time. "She was jumpy, always looking over her shoulder," Zendaya said. "I asked her if something was wrong, but she just smiled and said everything was fine. But I knew it wasn't." Noor's fear and desperation grew with each passing day. She felt like she was living on borrowed time, waiting for the moment when Bjorn would finally follow through on his threats. She stopped answering his texts, blocked his number, and tried to distance herself as much as possible. But Bjorn wouldn't let go. His messages became more erratic, his threats more intense. Noor later admitted to police that she felt like she was being hunted. "I didn't know what to do," she said during her interrogation. "He wouldn't leave me alone. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. I just wanted it to stop. It was a powder keg waiting to explode." And on the night of August 9th, 2024, everything came to a head. August 9th, 2024, was a sweltering Texas summer day, the kind of day where the heat clung to the air, thick and oppressive. But for the McKee family, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months was about to boil over. It was the day everything changed. The day began uneventfully, with most of the family gathering at Nor McKee's house. She had been hosting more often lately, desperate to maintain appearances and deflect any suspicion about her and Bjorn's fractured relationship. Bjorn, despite their estrangement, was there as well, mingling with cousins and uncles as if nothing was wrong. Nor spent most of the day avoiding Bjorn. She stayed in the kitchen, preparing food and chatting with Zendaya Dawson, her older sister, who had come by early to help. But even in the safety of the kitchen, she could feel Bjorn's presence like a shadow following her. Every glance from him, every moment their eyes met, sent a chill down her spine. Zendaya noticed Nor's unease. She leaned in and whispered, "You've been quiet all day. Is everything okay?" Nor forced a smile and shrugged it off, mumbling something about being tired. But Zendaya didn't believe her. As the day wore on, the atmosphere became heavier. Bjorn grew more restless, his usual charm giving way to sharp edges. Family members later described him as on edge, pacing the room and making sarcastic remarks to those around him. At one point, he made a comment to Nor in front of the entire family. "You're really good at hiding things, aren't you, Nor?" he said with a smirk. The room went quiet, and Nor's face turned pale. She muttered a response and quickly excused herself, retreating to the backyard to collect her thoughts. Bjorn followed her. No one knows exactly what was said between them in the backyard, but Zendaya, who caught a glimpse of their interaction through the kitchen window, later testified that Bjorn looked angry, gesturing wildly with his hands while Nor stood stiffly, her arms crossed. At one point, Bjorn stepped closer, leaning into Nor's face, and she took a step back. When they returned to the house, the tension was palpable. Bjorn sat in the corner of the living room, glaring at Nor whenever she entered the room. Nor kept her head down, avoiding eye contact and trying to focus on entertaining her guests. But her hands were shaking, and her smile never reached her eyes. As evening approached, most of the family began to leave. Zendaya stayed behind, helping Nor clean up. Bjorn stayed too, but his mood had only grown darker. He barely spoke, his silence more menacing than any words he could have said. The final blow came just after 9 p.m. Bjorn cornered Nor in the hallway, away from Zendaya's view. His voice was low but filled with anger. "I'm done playing games," he hissed. "You're going to talk to me, or I'll make sure everyone knows the truth tonight." Nor, terrified, tried to walk past him, but Bjorn grabbed her arm. She yanked herself free and stormed into the living room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Zendaya noticed immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to Nor's side. Before Nor could respond, Bjorn stormed into the room. His voice was loud now, his anger no longer contained. "You want to tell her, Nor?" he shouted. "Or should I?" Zendaya, now alarmed, stepped between them. "What's going on here?" she demanded. But neither Nor nor Bjorn answered her. Bjorn simply glared at Nor, his fists clenched, before turning and walking out the front door. Nor collapsed onto the couch, trembling. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to Zendaya. "He won't stop." Zendaya, realizing the gravity of the situation, decided to call the police. She told the dispatcher that there was a domestic disturbance at Nor's house and that she was worried it might escalate. She didn't mention Bjorn's threats or the history between him and Nor, only that he was acting erratic and making her sister feel unsafe. When the Behar County Sheriff's deputy arrived a short time later, Bjorn was sitting in his car in the driveway. The deputy, Chris Hester, spoke with Bjorn first, trying to de-escalate the situation. Bjorn, still fuming, insisted that everything was fine and that he was just having a family disagreement. Inside the house, Deputy Hester spoke with Nor and Zendaya. Nor, her voice shaky, downplayed the severity of the situation. "It's just a family argument," she said. "He'll calm down." Zendaya, unsure of how much to say, simply nodded in agreement. Satisfied that there was no immediate danger, Deputy Hester advised Bjorn to leave for the night and give everyone time to cool off. Bjorn agreed, though his expression betrayed his anger. He climbed into his car and started the engine, but instead of driving away, he sat there, staring at the house. Deputy Hester left the scene, believing the situation had been resolved. But he hadn't even made it a block away when his radio crackled with a second call from dispatch. The same address, the same family. "You need to get back over there," the voice on the radio said. "They're at it again." Hester flipped his car around and sped back to the house. What he found when he arrived was chaos. The scene outside Nor McKee's home had finally quieted after Deputy Chris Hester left. The driveway was empty except for Bjorn's car, its engine still running. From the kitchen window, Zendaya Dawson watched Bjorn sit there, unmoving, his face a dark silhouette in the glow of the dashboard lights. Nor stood in the corner of the living room, clutching a throw pillow to her chest, her entire body trembling. Zendaya turned back to Nor. "You need to call someone," she urged. "You can't keep handling this alone." Nor shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too late. He's not going to stop." Seconds later, Bjorn's car door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps approached the house. The front door flew open, and there he was again. Bjorn's face was flushed, his body tense with anger. He pointed a finger at Nor, his voice loud and venomous. "I'm not done with you," he shouted. "You think you can send the cops on me and walk away? You're pathetic, Nor. You think you're in control? You're nothing without me." Zendaya stood between them, her hands up in a protective stance. "Bjorn, stop it," she yelled. "You need to leave." Bjorn ignored her, his eyes locked on Nor. "You're not going to push me out of your life," he said, his voice lower now but no less threatening. "If I go down, I'm taking you with me. I'll tell them everything." Nor didn't say a word. She stood frozen, her back against the wall, as Bjorn's words cut deeper than any blade ever could. Zendaya's voice broke through the tension. "That's enough, Bjorn," she shouted, pushing him back. "You're out of control." Bjorn shoved Zendaya aside, not with force but with enough determination to make it clear he wasn't going to leave without confronting Nor. He moved closer to her, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. "If you think you're scared now," he hissed, "wait until I'm done with you." It was then that Bjorn allegedly grabbed Nor by the wrist, twisting it hard enough that she let out a sharp cry of pain. Zendaya lunged toward him, yelling, but Bjorn shoved her back. Nor managed to wrench her arm free and stumbled into the kitchen, with Bjorn following close behind. It was in the small, confined space of the kitchen that the fatal moment occurred. Desperate, cornered, and terrified, Nor reached for the first thing she could find, a kitchen knife. She gripped it tightly, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. "Don't come any closer," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. But Bjorn didn't stop. "What are you going to do, Nor?" he mocked, stepping closer, his hands raised in a taunting gesture. "You're not going to hurt me. You're too scared. You're too weak." And then it happened. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, Nor lashed out with the knife. The blade made contact, piercing Bjorn's back as he turned to move away. His body stiffened, his eyes wide with shock. He staggered back, clutching at his side, as blood began to pool beneath his shirt. "You stabbed me," he muttered, his voice full of disbelief. Bjorn stumbled out of the kitchen, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Zendaya, frozen in the corner, screamed his name, but he didn't respond. He made his way to the front door, his steps unsteady. By the time he reached his car, his face was pale, and his breathing labored. Bjorn climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he fumbled to start the car. Blood dripped from his back onto the upholstery. His body slumped forward for a moment before he sat upright again, gripping the steering wheel with a determined look in his eyes. The car screeched as he reversed out of the driveway and sped forward. But he didn't get far. Just moments later, the sound of a crash shattered the silence of the night. The family home shook as Bjorn's car slammed into the corner of the house, coming to a violent stop. Zendaya and Noor, both in shock, ran outside. The sight that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. Bjorn was slumped over the wheel, blood pooling around him. The front end of the car was embedded in the side of the house, smoke rising from the crumpled hood. Zendaya screamed, running to the car and banging on the driver's side window. "Bjorn! Bjorn!" she cried, her voice cracking with panic. But there was no response. Noor stood frozen on the porch, her hands still shaking, the knife lying at her feet. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief at what had just happened. Within minutes, the flashing lights of law enforcement vehicles illuminated the scene. Deputy Chris Hester was among the first to arrive, his earlier sense of relief now replaced with dread. As he stepped out of his patrol car, the gruesome sight of Bjorn's lifeless body in the car hit him like a punch to the gut. Hester later described the scene as chaotic and heartbreaking. Family members had begun to gather, drawn by the sound of the crash and the flashing lights. Zendaya was hysterical, pleading with the officers to help Bjorn, even as it became clear he was already gone. Noor remained on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, tears streaming down her face. When Hester approached Noor, she looked up at him with hollow eyes and whispered the words that would later define her case. "I didn't mean to. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't stop." Noor was immediately placed under arrest, handcuffed as her family looked on in stunned silence. She gave a brief statement to police at the scene, claiming that she had acted in self-defense. "He was going to kill me," she said. "I didn't have a choice." As the paramedics arrived to remove Bjorn's body, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone. The McKee family, once close-knit and full of love, had been torn apart in a single violent night. The night of August 9, 2024, was only the beginning. As the investigation into Bjorn Norton's death unfolded, two competing narratives emerged, one from the prosecution and the other from Noor McKee's defense team. Both painted vastly different pictures of the events leading up to that tragic night. The evidence, testimonies, and emotional weight of the case would captivate not only the McKee family but also the community at large. The prosecution wasted no time building their case. They argued that Noor McKee's actions were not those of a woman acting in self-defense, but rather of someone who had reached her breaking point and lashed out in anger. One of their key arguments was that Bjorn's threats, while disturbing, were not immediate. Prosecutors pointed out that there was no evidence Bjorn was armed that night. They claimed that while his behavior had been aggressive, he had not directly threatened Noor's life in the moments leading up to the stabbing. Their theory was that Noor, overwhelmed by years of secrecy, guilt, and conflict, had snapped. Prosecutor Annabella Huffman stated during opening arguments, "This was not a decision made out of fear. It was a decision made out of frustration and anger. Noor McKee wanted to end her problems, and she chose to do so with a knife." The physical evidence, they argued, supported their claims. Forensic analysis of Bjorn's wounds revealed that the knife had entered his back at an angle that suggested he had been turning away from Noor when she stabbed him. The prosecution used this detail to argue that Noor's actions were not defensive, but offensive. "She didn't stab him to protect herself," Huffman continued. "She stabbed him as he was retreating. That's not self-defense. That's retaliation." The prosecution also highlighted the timeline of events, specifically Bjorn's attempt to leave the house after the stabbing. If Noor had truly been in fear for her life, they argued, she would not have let him walk away to his car. Instead, the prosecutors claimed, she acted impulsively and then froze as the consequences of her actions unfolded. To further weaken Noor's claim of self-defense, the prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was manipulative and secretive. They emphasized the fact that Noor had kept her relationship with Bjorn hidden for years, calling her character into question. Huffman concluded, "This was a woman who had lied to everyone around her. She manipulated the truth for years, and on that night, she acted out of desperation, not fear." While the prosecution painted Noor as a manipulative liar, her defense team presented a vastly different story. For them, Noor was not just a woman trapped in a toxic relationship. She was a victim of years of mental and physical abuse, pushed to the edge by a man who refused to let her go. Noor's defense attorney, Iker Reynolds, argued that her actions were the result of a sustained campaign of manipulation and violence by Bjorn. In his opening statement, Reynolds told the jury, "This case is not about a crime of anger. It's about survival." Noor McKee was living in constant fear of a man who controlled her, threatened her, and left her with no way out. Reynolds detailed Bjorn's history of abuse, presenting evidence of his controlling and erratic behavior. He pointed to the hundreds of text messages Bjorn had sent Noor in the weeks leading up to his death, many of which were filled with threats and verbal abuse. Messages like, "You'll regret ignoring me. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. And if I see you again, I'll put you in a coma," were shown to the jury, painting a picture of a man who was not only volatile but dangerous. The defense also focused on the physical toll Bjorn's behavior had taken on Noor. They presented photos of bruises and injuries Noor had sustained in the months before the stabbing, including the black eye Bjorn had allegedly given her during an argument. Reynolds argued that these injuries were proof of Bjorn's escalating violence and Noor's growing fear for her safety. Noor wasn't just afraid of what Bjorn might do, Reynolds said. She was afraid of what he had already done. She knew his capacity for violence because she had experienced it firsthand. The defense argued that, on the night of August 9th, Noor had no choice but to defend herself. Reynolds described the moment in the kitchen as one of pure terror for Noor, emphasizing that Bjorn's physical aggression and verbal threats had left her no other option. "She didn't want to hurt him," Reynolds told the court. "But when you're backed into a corner, when your life is on the line, you do what you have to do to survive." The heart of the trial lay in the testimonies of those closest to Noor and Bjorn, family members who had seen the relationship unfold but hadn't understood the full extent of what was happening until it was too late. Zendaya Dawson, Noor's sister, took the stand to testify about the toxic relationship between Noor and Bjorn. Her voice was steady but emotional as she described the fear Noor had confided in her during the weeks leading up to the stabbing. "Noor told me she felt trapped," Zendaya said. "She said Bjorn wouldn't leave her alone. He would text her nonstop, show up at her house uninvited, and threaten to ruin her life. She was terrified of him, and I saw it with my own eyes. I saw the bruises. I saw the way she flinched when someone raised their voice. She was scared, and she had every right to be." Zendaya's testimony was supported by that of Deputy Chris Hester, the officer who had responded to the initial 911 call on the night of the incident. Hester described Bjorn as agitated and unpredictable when he first arrived at the scene. He admitted that he had felt uneasy leaving the house, but at the time, he believed the situation had been de-escalated. Hester's voice cracked as he described returning to the scene after the crash. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said. "When I saw the car, when I saw Bjorn, I'll never forget it." Not all the testimonies, however, supported Noor's claims. Bjorn's cousin, Kylie Suarez, spoke in defense of his character. She described Bjorn as a kind and caring man who would never intentionally hurt anyone. "Bjorn wasn't perfect," Kylie said, "but he wasn't a monster either. He was struggling. He was lost. But he didn't deserve to die like this." Kylie's testimony introduced a note of doubt into the proceedings, forcing the jury to grapple with the complexity of the case. The investigation revealed two opposing versions of the truth, one of a woman pushed to the brink by years of abuse, and another of a man who became the victim of an impulsive act of violence. The jury was left to decide which version they believed. The trial of Noor McKee for the second-degree murder of her nephew, Bjorn Norton, captivated not just her local Texas community but people far beyond it. The case, with its layers of forbidden love, manipulation, and violence, raised questions that were as emotional as they were unsettling. Was Noor a desperate woman pushed to her limit by years of abuse, or was she a manipulative figure who acted out of anger and frustration? In the courtroom, this battle of narratives unfolded with intensity. Over the course of the trial, emotional testimonies, damning evidence, and heart-wrenching moments kept the jury, and the audience, on edge. The trial began with the prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Annabella Huffman. With a stern tone and precise language, she laid out the state's case against Noor. Huffman's argument was simple. This was not self-defense but a calculated act of violence. She began by presenting the texts Noor had received from Bjorn. Screenshots were projected onto a large monitor for the courtroom to see. The words, filled with venom and threats, were undeniable. Messages like, "You'll regret ignoring me. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. You think you can run from me? You can't." These texts, Huffman argued, showed that while Bjorn's behavior was aggressive, his threats were not imminent. Huffman said, "These were words, and words, while troubling, do not justify stabbing someone in the back." The prosecution then presented forensic evidence, focusing on the angle of the wound. Medical examiners testified that Bjorn's injuries suggested he was turning away when he was stabbed. Huffman pointed out that Bjorn's actions after the stabbing, his attempt to flee the house and drive away, indicated that he was no longer a threat when Noor attacked him. Noor McKee had time to think, Huffman argued. This wasn't a split-second decision. She wasn't defending her life. She was acting on her anger, her frustration, her desperation to silence him forever. The testimony that followed was equally emotional and damning. Kylie Suarez, Bjorn's cousin, took the stand and shared stories of the man she believed Bjorn to be. Bjorn wasn't perfect, Kylie admitted, her voice trembling. He could be intense, sure, but he wasn't a violent person. He cared about his family and he cared about Noor. He wasn't trying to hurt her, he was trying to be heard. And now he's gone. Kylie's testimony was meant to humanize Bjorn, to show the jury that he was more than just the aggressive texts they'd seen. But when it came time for the defense to present their case, the tone in the courtroom shifted dramatically. When Noor McKee took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She looked small and fragile as she walked to the witness box, her shoulders slumped and her eyes filled with tears. This was the first time she would publicly tell her side of the story. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she described her relationship with Bjorn. She spoke about how it started with late-night conversations and emotional support and how it eventually turned into something she never anticipated. "I loved him," Noor admitted, her voice cracking. "But it was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I tried to end it, but he wouldn't let me go." She detailed how Bjorn's behavior changed over time, how his possessiveness turned into control, and how his love turned into threats. The jury listened as Noor recounted the night he gave her a black eye, the endless texts, and the fear that kept her awake at night. "I lived in constant fear," Noor said, breaking down into sobs. "I couldn't leave my house without looking over my shoulder. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't think. He told me he would ruin my life, and I believed him." The courtroom grew emotional as Noor described the night of August 9th. Tears streamed down her face as she relived the moment in the kitchen. "I didn't want to hurt him," she said, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted him to stop. I wanted him to stop scaring me, to stop hurting me. He was so close. He wouldn't stop yelling. And I just panicked. I grabbed the knife and I didn't even realize what I'd done until I saw the blood." When the prosecution cross-examined Noor, their tone was sharp and unrelenting. Huffman pressed Noor on why she hadn't sought help sooner. "You said you lived in fear for years," Huffman said. "So why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you tell your family the truth about what was happening?" Noor's hands trembled as she answered. "I was ashamed," she said. "How do you tell your family something like that? How do you admit to them that you've made a mistake so big it could destroy everything? I was afraid of what they'd think of me." Huffman didn't let up. "But you weren't too ashamed to continue the relationship for 3 years, were you? You weren't too afraid to let it go on, even when you knew it was wrong?" Noor's tears returned as she struggled to answer. Her silence in that moment was deafening. Huffman turned to the jury, letting Noor's hesitation speak for itself. But the defense fought back with equal force. Iker Reynolds, Noor's attorney, used his cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses to shift the focus back to Bjorn's behavior. He highlighted the threats, the physical violence, and the toxic power dynamic between them. Reynolds grilled Kylie Suarez on her glowing description of Bjorn. You said he wasn't violent, he began. But were you there the night he gave Nora a black eye? Were you the one receiving texts that said, "If I see you again, I'll put you in a coma"? Were you the one living in fear every single day? Kylie stammered, admitting she hadn't seen those specific moments but insisting Bjorn was misunderstood. Reynolds also questioned Deputy Chris Hester, asking him why he left the house that night. You said you felt uneasy about the situation, Reynolds stated. So why didn't you stay longer? Why didn't you ensure Nor was safe? Hester hesitated. I thought the situation had de-escalated, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't know it would end like this. The defense ended their arguments by driving home the idea that Nor was a victim, not a perpetrator. Reynolds addressed the jury directly in his closing statement. She was a woman who lived in fear every single day. She didn't ask for this relationship. She didn't want it to happen. But Bjorn refused to let her go. On that night, she acted out of survival, not out of anger. And if any of us had been in her shoes, we might have done the same. The courtroom drama was as emotional as it was complex. Both sides presented compelling arguments, and the jury was left to untangle the threads of love, fear, and violence that defined Nor and Bjorn's tragic relationship. The trial of Nor McKee came to a dramatic conclusion on a warm autumn day in November 2024. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as the jury filed back into their seats after nearly 8 hours of deliberation. Family members sat rigidly in the gallery, their faces a mixture of anticipation and dread. Nor sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the floor. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that contained Nor's fate. The judge asked the question that everyone had been waiting to hear. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson cleared their throat, their voice steady but somber. We, the jury, find the defendant, Nor McKee, guilty of second-degree murder. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Zendaya Dawson began to cry softly, her head bowed as she clutched a tissue in her hands. Nor remained still, her face pale, her expression unreadable. The judge continued, sentencing her to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The verdict was final, but it left no one feeling victorious. The prosecution celebrated the decision as justice for Bjorn Norton. Prosecutor Annabella Huffman later told reporters, "This verdict shows that no matter the circumstances, taking another person's life will have consequences. While we recognize that this was a deeply complicated case, the jury's decision reflects the principle that there were other ways this situation could have been handled." The defense team, however, expressed their disappointment. Iker Reynolds, Nor's attorney, told the press, "We believe Nor's actions were taken in the context of immense fear and abuse. While we respect the jury's decision, we remain convinced that Nor did not deserve to spend the next 25 years of her life behind bars. This case was a tragedy for everyone involved." Nor herself was stoic as she was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs. She did not speak, though her tear-streaked face told the story of a woman who had lost everything: her freedom, her family, and the life she once knew. For the McKee family, the verdict brought no closure, only more heartbreak. Bjorn was gone, and Nor was now facing decades in prison. The once close family was shattered, divided by grief, guilt, and anger. Zendaya Dawson, who had been Nor's strongest supporter throughout the trial, struggled with mixed emotions. She mourned Bjorn, the vibrant nephew she had loved, but she also felt the weight of Nor's suffering. "I lost them both that night," Zendaya said during a television interview. "Bjorn is gone, and now Nor is gone too. I can't make sense of it. How do you reconcile something like this?" Other family members were less forgiving. Bjorn's cousin, Kylie Suarez, expressed anger at the leniency of Nor's sentence. "She took his life," Kylie said, "and in 15 years she'll get hers back. That's not justice." Tensions ran high within the family, with some members choosing to cut ties with one another. The shared grief that might have brought them closer instead pushed them further apart. The McKee family's gatherings, once lively and full of laughter, became distant memories. Holidays passed quietly, with empty seats at the table serving as painful reminders of what had been lost. This case left more than just a broken family. It left lingering questions about the cost of secrecy, shame, and forbidden relationships. Nor's relationship with Bjorn, once a source of comfort for both of them, had become a ticking time bomb. It was a relationship forged in vulnerability and desperation, but one that could only survive in the dark. The psychological toll of keeping their secret, combined with the manipulation and abuse that followed, ultimately destroyed them both. For Nor, the affair was an escape from the loneliness of her divorce and the expectations of her family. For Bjorn, it was a way to feel important, valued, and loved. But the same secret that bound them together also poisoned their lives. The guilt, fear, and shame ate away at them until it culminated in violence. This case is a grim reminder of how deeply family dynamics can shape our lives, for better or worse. It shows how manipulation, when left unchecked, can spiral into tragedy. And it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about love, control, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. In the end, there were no winners. Bjorn's life was cut short, Nor's freedom was taken away, and the family they both loved was left broken. The McKee family's story serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets and the devastating consequences of shame and silence. It reminds us that some wounds never fully heal, and some choices cannot be undone. In the end, this is not just a story of one crime. It is a story of two lives destroyed by secrecy, desperation, and violence. Bjorn Norton, a young man full of promise, lost his life in the most tragic way, and Nor McKee, a woman who once seemed to have everything under control, now faces decades behind bars. Two lives, intertwined in ways they never should have been, both came to a devastating end. The question that lingers is this: could this tragedy have been prevented? What if Nor had sought help earlier? What if Bjorn had been able to walk away? What if the family, so close-knit on the surface, had seen the signs of the toxic relationship brewing right in front of them? These what-ifs hang over the McKee family like a dark cloud, leaving a haunting sense of regret and unanswered questions. Could a different choice, made at a different time, have saved both lives? This story forces us to reflect on the consequences of secrecy and shame. It shows how a web of lies, no matter how carefully constructed, can eventually collapse under its own weight. And it reminds us that some wounds, whether they are physical, emotional, or generational, can have consequences that ripple far beyond the people directly involved. As we close this chapter, we are left with the chilling reality of what unfolded that night. Family shattered, community in mourning, and two lives lost, one to the grave and the other to the justice system. But perhaps the most haunting part of all is that there are no easy answers here. This is a story that doesn't end with justice or closure, but with pain, reflection, and a reminder of the fragility of human relationships. Thank you for watching this story on our channel. If you found this case as thought-provoking and haunting as we have, please make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories. We'll continue to bring you the most compelling and heartbreaking cases, because behind every headline, there's a deeper story waiting to be told. Let us know your thoughts on this case in the comments. Do you believe justice was served? Or do you think this tragedy could have been avoided?